The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the podcast belong solely to the hosts and not the host's past, present, or future employers. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It's Brian, Mr. Betcher for Breaking Down Security.
Hello.
Yeah, so Miss Berlin's out this week. She's taking a mental health day. I actually had a mental health day. Our company, Leviathan, did a mental health holiday yesterday. So I spent my day just thinking about stuff and actually prepping for this. So I actually went through and, I did more prep than I normally do, but it's important. We have an interview today. Mr. Betcher, I'm sure you are very interested in this as well, because this would affect you from a incident response kind of way, because some of the concepts we're going to be talking about deals with incident response and preventative measures. So
yeah, definitely prevent.
Yeah,
right. Anything you can do to help prevent
right
takes a lot of workload and a lot of risk away from you.
Yep. Before we get started, Incident Response Podcast that you're on with Michael Goff. 2 episodes have dropped. We've taken the breaking part off, and it's where can they find it? And it's all about incident response. So where can they find that?
It's called the Incident Response Podcast, and it should be everywhere that it used to be now, just under a different name. We've got like a temporary logo or whatnot.
Okay.
And we actually recorded another episode yesterday.
Oh, so, badass. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So I don't know when that's going to drop, but pretty soon.
Okay.
And so, that's kicked back up. And I guess we'll start going strong again on that.
Yeah. You just follow Hacker Hurricane on Twitter, and he, I think, posted links to that if you're interested in an incident response podcast. There's not enough of those out there, so we definitely need to have more education about that, and specifically on incident response. And so there you go.
Right. The reason we kicked it back up was mostly because of listeners, and the tension kept building.
Right.
And we just had to release another one because the demand was so high.
Makes sense.
We had some angry listeners, right?
Oh yeah. I can understand that. If they don't get a lot of that, and we can only cover so many topics so many times a year, so it makes sense to have additional educational opportunities out there for folks. So, all right, well, let's go ahead and get started. For those of you who listen regularly, we don't normally answer emails from PR companies because a lot of times they want to highlight the latest blockchain, Bitcoin, machine language, machine learning, AI, something. I really don't answer those because they're either hawking a product or they're hawking God knows what. But this one was for an organization that I think we hear about a lot, and a lot of folks may not understand exactly what it's about and the initiatives that they're doing. And they're vendor agnostic. They have a lot of folks on their board, so they're not pushing a specific implementation or specific product. So I said yes, and we are happy to have Andrew join us. Andrew is the Executive Director and Chief Marketing Officer of the FIDO Alliance. And Phyto, he can tell you a little bit about that, but welcome, Andrew, to the show.
Thank you, Brian and Brian.
Cool. So Andrew, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you ended up becoming the director and CMO of the FIDO Alliance. What does it take to get to that level?
Yeah, sure. So again, thanks for having me. I've been with FIDO since 2016. I have a personal background in a couple of things. One, I've helped run multi-stakeholder organizations, so other standards groups. Before this, I worked with a group called Tizen Association, which was trying to attempt to standardize a kind of open mobile Linux platform before Android came out. So that didn't go so well. And then prior to that, I also helped launch something called Liberty Alliance, which is very germane to what we're talking about today. So Liberty Alliance back in 2001, this is when I was working at Sun Microsystems, launched it was launched to create federated identity, right? So it was launched in response to the threat of, frankly, Microsoft at the time had something called Microsoft Hailstorm, or Microsoft Passport, which was their attempt to kind of centralize logins through Microsoft to the internet. And their story was simple to all these new service providers who were kind of new to the internet in 2001, and their message was, hey, just log in through us, and then we'll provision services on your behalf to your customers. And ultimately, businesses didn't like that, right? So Sun and a bunch of companies got together to launch Liberty Alliance. We created the concept of identity federation, which were then poured into SAML, SAML 1, SAML 2, and it's taken root to this day. So that was kind of my first exposure to organizations like this, but also in the identity space. And then I went on from there to help drive a lot of Sun's identity management kind of go-to-market activities and product set. So very roundabout way of saying that with a background in identity, background in consortia like this, I was well positioned to get involved with the organization, the FIDO Alliance, in 2016 to help initially drive its marketing, and over time I've just kind of taken on more responsibilities as the alliance has grown and as my role has grown as well.
Okay, so for some housekeeping, I've turned on audio and video for our Zoom, but we're not going to be posting the video. I just want to make sure we have a backup in case something happens to my computer. So there you go, Andrew.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So FIDO is just one. Are they the largest organization dealing with identity management and identity environments, or is there other environments? Or do you have other choices?
Yeah, I mean, Brian, it's interesting in your intro talking about how I usually don't take PR firm requests and how FIDO has multi-stakeholders and a lot of companies on the board, and we're not pitching product here, right? Mm-hmm. But what's interesting about FIDO, as opposed to a lot of standards initiatives, is that there isn't an alternative, right? FIDO truly is the industry coming together, working together to address challenges of user authentication, right? So our mission, globally, is to move the world beyond passwords, right? Stop being dependent on passwords, and we're fundamentally trying to shift the world from a means of authentication, which is focused on server-side shared secrets, whether that be passwords or OTPs, to one that is more decentralized in nature, leveraging asymmetric public key cryptography, right? Where the user authenticates locally to the device in their hand or with the device in their hand. And on the server side, all you have is public keys. Right. So that we think that will get rid of, scalable attacks and all the nefarious things that are associated with credential theft and credential reuse and all those bad things. So going back to your question about, is there another FIDO? No, there really isn't, right? So that's really helped accelerate, I think, the kind of the adoption and the development of FIDO standards, is that there isn't a distraction, there isn't an anti-FIDO or anything like that. Now, the lineage of FIDO is quite interesting, right? So FIDO was launched in 2012 to address really, we're looking at passwords, but passwords are the tip of the spear of the data breach problem, right? So ultimately, we're trying to address the data breach problem. The vast majority of data breaches are caused by passwords, either someone being phished or a weak password protecting sensitive data, whatever it might be. Passwords are the problem. And that's the easiest thing for us to address, and that's what we're doing. There were two initiatives happening at the same time, both leveraging the same kind of core architecture. One was focused on the mobile use case, and one was focused on the second factor use case, right? So FIDO has founded really these two groups at the same time, and they came together inside the alliance, right? And those two efforts resulted in our first set of specifications, right? So the first set of FIDO specs were called UAF, Universal Authentication Framework, and then U2F, Universal Second Factor. UAF was driven by a company called Knock Knock Labs, Lenovo, Samsung, and PayPal, right? So and I'm missing some companies there, but those are kind of the key instigators. And Knock Knock had this idea of basically leveraging a biometric on a device, which was new at the time. Samsung had one, that was about it. With a Samsung device, walked into PayPal to a guy by the name of Michael Barrett, who was their CISO at the time, who was also the former president of Liberty Alliance. That's you start seeing these connections with this idea. And he said, yes, this is great, but why don't you go standardize this, right? I don't want a bespoke thing. Let's get an industry movement behind this approach to user authentication. And so they started on that path. At around the same time, Ubico and NXP and Google, a couple other companies were working on U2F, right? And I'm sure your listeners know what U2F is. It's security keys. So Yubico helped lead that effort with YubiKeys, which they already had on market, but bring this the FIDO approach to this for user authentication. Right, but both two of these approaches have the same belief in kind of privacy preserving user authentication based on public key cryptography, and that's why they said. And we have a founding privacy principles document actually that hasn't changed in 8 years. That covers all of our specifications, protects privacy, and again, through this mechanism that both specs use to authenticate users.
Okay.
Sorry for the barking dog.
Just to back up, you're saying that public key is on the server only? Public keys only, and then the private key is what? Something you have, or how does that work?
Yeah, the private key is something you have. So both two specs, and we'll kind of come back to FIDO at the higher level. The key thing we're doing is introducing the concept of an authenticator, right? The authenticator is a concept, it's a thing, it's part of the architecture, but you authenticate locally, you verify yourself to the authenticator. The authenticator essentially mediates the authentication process, if you will. So rather than me logging on directly to a server, I authenticate to the authenticator, my private key is stored in the authenticator. And the authenticator talks to the private key talks to the public key on the server, and a fair amount of metadata is exchanged in that process as well. But when I enroll, so this all starts, I know you very quickly jumped into the depths of FIDO here. This all starts at enrollment, right? So when I enroll my FIDO credentials, a unique key pair is created, right? And the private key, again, stays with me on my device, and the public key goes on the server. And then when it comes time to log in, I'm challenged to prove my presence, right? And once I do so, that essentially unlocks the private key, and then the private key and public key communicate to as part of the authentication ceremony to complete the authentication and login process.
Nice.
But one interesting, so in that key pair, a lot of data is embedded in there, including a very unique URL string, and it has to match just so. And this is how FIDO prevents phishing, right? So as a second factor, as a primary factor, this dialogue between the private key and public key, can't be spoofed and needs to match appropriately in order for you to be authenticated.
Does that work in a domain environment as well, not just like websites?
Yeah, it can do. You can use security keys to authenticate to local resources as well. So Microsoft bring this forward in their enterprise products, Azure AD, for enterprise settings, and you can use a key for local logins as well.
Cool. Awesome. So let me go back to my notes here. So we all know that password breaches are a thing. The idea is, it sounds like we're trying to remove the weak link in the chain, which is, we have an application, we set it up, it's all secure and everything, and then you have, Dave, the user over in the corner, who sets, Go Steelers, 12 or something like that, and your security model's busted because you don't have users setting up proper passwords. I use Google, a lot of Google, and when I log into my email, I get the little pop-up on my my phone. It says, "Hey, is this you? Did you log in? Yes, no." Other sites I have, Google Auth, where it gives me a code that recycles every 30 minutes or 30 seconds, not 30 minutes. Whew, that's a lot. And then, there's even others that are, sadly, like my bank, the largest credit union in the world, where they're still using SMS two-factor. Ideally, the idea is to not use all of these different types of two factors because, one, it can get complicated and can get, there's issues there with security. NIST has obviously deprecated the SMS two-factor because of security issues with SIM swapping and what have you. Is there one good way of implementing U2F? Is there a completely secure method of doing FIDO or U2F, or so that everybody can feel safe? And are there any downsides to any of the ones that we're using right now?
Well, yeah. So first of all, any second factor is better than the password alone, right? Even SMS OTP or anything, will address 98% of the scalable phishing attacks that dupe so many users, right? So let me get that out there. Any second factor is better than one factor, one weak password,
right?
But I think the key thing to understand is that it's not so much about passwords being weak. I mean, weak passwords are easier to crack than tough passwords, but any password is susceptible, right? Anything's susceptible to a phishing attack, and so a lot of the methods you mentioned, actually, even like the TOTP method with the auth apps, even those are susceptible to man-in-the-middle attacks and relay attacks, right? A clever phisher can actually get through that by relaying the code that you're entering. These are still server-side secrets which can be manipulated,
right.
Which is why I'm glad you're a G Suite user. If you look at Google Advanced Protection, Google Advanced Protection is a free service made available to people, but the preferred, if not the only method of authentication supported there is FIDO security keys, right? Because FIDO security keys are unphishable. You can't spoof that communication between the private key and public key. There's no opportunity for a man-in-the-middle attack. So it really is unphishable user authentication. I'm trying to remember the rest of your question. I think that's the best. That is the strongest way of doing authentication on market, bar none.
Mm-hmm. So I think it depends on which implementation you're using. There's a different technology problem there, because the idea is, yes, we can have this really secure authentication mechanism, and we talked about this before the show, but if a member of my family who, the vast majority of them are not technically proficient, is required to use this, I can see there being a problem with a product that's like, oh yeah, we're all secure and we're using, FIDO and whatever. And it's like, well, if my family member doesn't want to use that and they go to another site, there's lost sales there. There's lost business opportunities in some cases. How are we making it user friendly for, regular average people and not just, security professionals who are like, yes, we need to definitely have security?
Yeah, absolutely. So, FIDO doesn't necessarily specify modality, right? So we support security keys. We also support biometrics. And I think when you start talking about bringing this to the masses, I think that's where biometrics really come into play. So biometrics on your phone, on your device, on your MacBook, your laptop, whatever it might be. That's where I think this starts to gain scale. Because the idea, as much as, we'd love to see it, but the idea of every consumer having a security key on their keychain and touching it or entering it to use it all the time, it's just doesn't scale that well. It's great for the enterprise and great for prosumers, but for the average user, to get critical scale, I just don't think that's going to happen. But biometrics certainly do, right? Everyone has a phone, and the vast majority of phones has biometric capabilities on it. And part of what I think FIDO's promise is to allow people to, again, leverage the local devices that they use every day, or literally in their hands every hour, not more frequently. You see, my kids, to authenticate. Right. And so part of the paradigm, so you're going back to the lineage of FIDO specifications, right? So I kind of left off talking about UAF and U2F. And then, for FIDO, what we realized, even though there's good adoption of both those specs, to gain scale, to really push our specifications and get adoption out there in the marketplace, we had to target the web. And we had to bring this into the platform, right? So we did two things, right? So we were working on some web APIs, what were called the FIDO 2.0 web APIs. We submitted those to W3C. The standardization body of the web, and that became the Web Authentication Working Group. That became WebAuthn, right? And through that effort, through this collaboration in W3C, where ultimately had a lot, the band was pretty tight between the FIDO contributors and the W3C contributors. That became the WebAuthn specification, which is then built into every browser today that you can use, right? So that brings FIDO to the web as a platform. At the same time, Microsoft and Google, started actually building FIDO directly into their platforms. Right, so every Android handset now, Android 7 or later handset, is a FIDO certified authenticator, meaning you can use that biometric in that device to authenticate yourself to mobile websites, native apps, things on that Android device. Likewise, Windows Hello and Windows 10. Windows Hello is a FIDO certified authenticator. So any Windows 10 desktop allows you to use a biometric on that device, or a local PIN. This is a nuance people don't understand. A local PIN is as good of a biometric as it's local, and it's proven possession. You can use that to log on to websites. So this is where you start getting scale. You talk about like how do average consumers use FIDO? This is how they will. We believe this is how you start getting it out there. And it's all using the same public key cryptography goodness as the initial specs. It just extends that paradigm further. So in fact, U2F has been renamed CTAP. I don't want to get into protocols too much, but U2F is now called CTAP 1. CTAP 2 is what's in FIDO 2, the next wave of specs. Mm-hmm. And the key difference between CTAP 2, CTAP 1, FIDO 2, and U2F is that it brings a new use case, which is actually allowing you to use your device as a security key. Right? So Google's already actually released this. So you can actually log into your Google services with your handset by pressing, and it's directly communicating to your PC to secure and protect your Google services. Right? So I think that's the future of where this is going. Right? That type of use case, using the mobile to do more and more things, using a wearable. Right? You could do FIDO on a watch. Knock has an SDK for this. Using a wearable to authenticate things that are literally in your hands every day that people understand how to interact with.
Right.
That's where this gets scale. And I think, the challenge is partly a user education challenge, right? People do passwords because that's all they know. People have slowly gotten trained in doing SMS OTP, no matter how clunky that is and how risky that is, because they're getting used to that, right? But the good news is that, it's been proven that people can use this new paradigm, right? Apple did a wonderful service for the industry when they introduced Touch ID, right? First of all, they introduced locking your phone, and then they introduced unlocking your phone. And you could actually touch your phone to unlock it, right? Because people are very comfortable. And initially, there was some challenge in uptake, but as soon as people saw the simplicity of that, they use it. And now, you can't find, again, vast majority of smartphones have biometrics. Most of those are biometric unlock or local PIN unlock even. But that education, showed people that you can actually use your body to unlock something. And now, the next step is saying I can use my body to log into something. And that's what FIDO is allowing you to do.
Okay. So Mr. Boettcher, he's a blue teamer. And I don't say that as a 4-letter word, but his organization has to deal with a lot of different disparate systems. So how would somebody who's a blue teamer right now go to their boss and go, hey, this FIDO thing sounds like something we need to do to increase our security. I don't want to bring up the COVID thing, but everybody's working at home now, and our VPN uses 2-factor, but it probably could be using, FIDO, or it could be using, hardware keys. What's the level of effort to implement something like this? Does it just really depend on the vendor you're using for, remote access systems, or is it more of a, you got to buy a blinky box, or you have to, engage another company to buy, middleware or third-party ware?
Yeah, so you can do it a couple of ways. You can kind of roll your own and build your own server, from the FIDO specifications, or you can license software from a third party. So FIDO does a couple of things as a body. One, we create specifications and we submit them to formal standards bodies, right? So that's the main thing we do. And the specs, reflect tens of thousands of hours of IP poured into it from, really the brightest minds, in authentication, across the world. But the very important second step is certification, right? So we've certified products against, both to be that they're conformant to specifications. And then very importantly, we also certify that they interoperate, right? So, and I think you need that, right? So,
right.
So these products all work together. So if you're looking to implement, you can, we have a listing of the 600 something FIDO certified products on our website. You can work with any of those vendors to implement. Additionally, most IAM stacks that you're using and most remote access stacks, tend to have support for FIDO security keys at a minimum as a means of authentication. So I'd talk, so you have something in place, talk to your vendors, see if they support FIDO security keys. That's going to be the easiest thing you can do, to protect your workforce today, your remote workforce. Get them some keys. We have a lot of vendors who sell keys. You can buy them on Amazon. Just make sure they're FIDO certified, and then they can use that to start logging into the. It depends on what the system is you're using, but if it supports FIDO already, they get to put keys in their hands. Otherwise, something else you might need to do is deploy a FIDO server. Again, all readily available, relatively easy to implement. I hear, from our vendors, it could be anywhere from a day to a week, depending on what you're aiming to do.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a massive heterogeneous architecture, it'll take a little bit longer, but the good news is, our vendor community has really got a lot of practice under their hands. So people are deploying, especially in enterprise, right? And so They're identifying common challenges in enterprise deployments that they can solve with either their products off the shelf or maybe some custom integration, whatever needs to happen. But
Cool.
it certainly is viable, and there's an active community out there ready to support.
Yeah.
So my question was, if I'm going to choose a bank or see if my bank is FIDO certified, where do I go? And I just Googled my bank and FIDO, and I see that there's an article that says, hey, your bank is FIDO certified or whatever. And here's some other companies that also got certified. Is that all someone needs to do?
Well, so your bank, now this is a different use case, right? So as a consumer, is my service provider FIDO certified? They need to implement a FIDO server and roll that out to their consumers, right? And so as a consumer right now, it's pretty invisible to you. In fact, a lot of the initial native apps were using FIDO that no one really knew, like Bank of America rolled out UAF in their app, right? And it looks the same as Touch ID or Face ID or whatever biometric you're using, but it's actually using FIDO under the hood. T-Mobile's done the same thing, and Intuit's done the same thing with their mobile products. It's a pretty seamless user experience. It's interesting that once you start bringing this to the web, this is where WebAuthn and FIDO 2 kicks in. You start. This is where the next kind of wave of adoption is happening, and we're initiating some programs at FIDO Alliance, and this will be coming out next week to help these service providers be successful in their implementations of FIDO in a couple of ways. One, we think it's important for consumers to understand what's going on, right? So we're introducing a consumer mark. You can go visit www.loginwithfido.com. To see what this new consumer mark looks like and some of the assets and educational pieces there. So we think that we will encourage service providers who are using FIDO to tell you, Brian, go back to your question, that they are using FIDO. And there might be a little mark. We have what we call the I mark, the I in FIDO, the standalone mark. You might have a FIDO certified mark, FIDO Alliance badge, whatever it might be. But we think that there's merit to letting people know that they're being protected and that they're having a better user experience, right? And that's one way you can find out, once people start using these marks, that you are indeed using FIDO authentication. So that's if you want to query your service provider, that's the easiest thing to do. And more and more people are deploying FIDO, so there's a good chance that they will be using it, if not now, in the near future.
Right. Yeah, I'm looking at
this.
Is
there competition for FIDO? Like, is there an anti-FIDO alliance? Is there a different group or alliance that, I don't know, competes?
There isn't a competing alliance. There isn't a competing standard. The competition would be people just implementing their own way, right? I mean, as far as moving beyond passwords, right? There's a lot of proprietary stuff out there, and some of it's quite good, right? There's other people who are using public key cryptography, vendors who are doing this in a very FIDO-like way and providing, solutions that can protect consumers. And those are fine by me, in our book, we're all out to achieve the same goal, right? Stop data breaches, stop the credential theft cycle, and these approaches all do that. Now, our belief is that as the ecosystem kind of rallies behind FIDO as a standard, and vendors look for FIDO certified solution, it behooves these companies to actually bring their technology into the alliance, get it certified so they could take part of the broader opportunity. But the competition would be kind of roll your own implementations. I mean, the real competition is password-based authentication, and that's where we're looking to get beyond.
Right. So one of the things, because I looked up, and if you go into the show notes, there's a data flow diagram roughly that kind of shows how things like WebAuthn and FIDO work. Was the need to add biometrics for folks that are using two-factor, but like some folks, like I surf the web on my phone and it's like, oh yeah, you log in with your password and it's, oh yeah, use your two-factor token. And I'm like, well, my second factor's also on the same phone that I'm, logging in with. So there is no second factor because they own my phone. They're going to be able to own pretty much everything on there, including the login to my site. So, or to whatever site I was using. So how do we, is the tokens or is the keys or are those the the verified second factor or hey we noticed you're logging in on a mobile device, you can use your Face ID. Was that just a way to kind of move the second factor off of phone only?
No, we see biometric on the phone, and using biometric on the phone, that is 2FA, right? And it's been ruled as such. So for complying with things like PSD2, some of the NIST guidelines, right? The NIST 863B-3 guidelines for update identity guidelines actually specify it's called multi-factor cryptographic device. Right. So any sort of mobile handset. And I could put the link in here in our little show guide. Any handset that has protects stores the biometric in a secure enclave, basically in a device, which is any modern smartphone really, can be seen as a two-factor, right? So the one factor is possession, other factor is your biometric, right? And that's really important for things like PSD2 in Europe. Anyone who's in payments, listening to this will relate to the challenge that PSD2 is presenting for European merchants, where it mandates a strong second factor. The way they've been doing it traditionally is through a pop-up or through some redirect or through an SMS OTP, which is causing too much friction for consumers, right? Our view, and we talked to the European Banking Authority about this, our view is that a FIDO biometric again is two factors in one gesture. It can do things like transaction signing, which is important for that space, to address both stronger user authentication, also meeting with regulatory requirements. So that's the kind of part of the beauty of biometrics is ease of use and scale.
Okay, all right. So let's say I have a nice.
I just want to make one note. Since we're talking about biometrics, I want to point out one very important thing about the FIDO model versus other biometric models. So going to Brian's question before about competition. Not all biometrics are the same, right? So what I've been talking about with FIDO, it's all local on your device, right? You authenticate locally, the private key stays on the device, and it talks to public key on a server. Likewise, biometrics, when you're using FIDO, never leave the device. Very important, right? Because data breaches are horrible, stolen passwords are horrible. What's worse than that? Stolen biometrics. Because you can't get them back, and the damage there is terrifying, right? So very important, going back to FIDO's privacy principles or architectural principles, is that all the user data stays local on the device. And in fact, going back to the regulatory thread, GDPR in Europe specifies biometrics as highly sensitive data that need to stay local. So that's another thing that FIDO's doing from a compliance standpoint is by maintaining local match biometrics, we're meeting that requirement as well.
Okay. I'm just, thinking as a bad guy might. It sounds like the endpoints would still be where you would want to attack, because you need to get that private key to be able to impersonate the person, or if you're a user who's running a jailbroken device that allows for installing applications on the side or outside of the Google Play, or if you're using Cydia or something like that. Being able to infiltrate the device in some way to gain access to those private keys. I'm just trying to think outside the box on those when when I'm coming up with that. So,
so that's part of what we're doing also.
If the device is completely compromised, can you just throw out two-factor? Because if the device is compromised, then you're logging in with the same device that your biometrics are on, for example. Does that pretty much defeat the purpose of two-factor?
If the device is like in your hands and you have my device, or if the device is compromised through malware attacks or something like that?
Through malware attacks and so forth. Right. So I log in somewhere, and well, let's just say the device can then do a replay attack, or the attacker can, because the device decides whether or not your biometrics is valid, right? So there's a difference between logging in with your computer and then using your handheld device as the second factor different than using your handheld device to log in and do the second factor on the same device? I mean, how does that work, right? How is that mitigated?
So one thing we're doing, it's a great question. Before we talked about, and I just put a link in our group document there. We talked about the concept of the authenticator, right? The authenticator is where the private key is stored. That's where the user, authenticates to, if you will. We've also introduced a certification program for different levels of assurance for how well the private key is protected in the device. So it's called our FIDO Certified Authenticator Level Certification Program. There's actually 6 different levels contemplated, but at a high level, L1, our base level certification, for an authenticator means that it meets the FIDO specs, it's passed, some vendor questionnaire, and it's proven to be unphishable. An L2 authenticator protects against malware attacks, right? And so to be an L2 authenticator, protects against device OS compromise. It specifies that the device must support what we call a restricted operating environment, so like a secure element, whatever the choice may be. But that's how the private key is protected from malware attacks, which would start to mitigate against the threat you're talking about. And L3 is actually a certification level that protects against brute force or malware attacks. And those higher level certification programs are run in conjunction with third-party programs from groups like Global Platform, BIS, and other kind of partner programs, if you will. So, depending on the use case, some people may specify that one needs to have an L2 authenticator versus an L1 authenticator, right? So, for example, even within a bank, right? That's part of why we did this. This certification program is driven by requirements from relying parties. But within a bank, for example, you might just log into your account. We want to make sure that the consumer has easy access to log in their accounts. But inside the bank, maybe it's someone in the Treasury Department who's transferring billions of dollars. They might need an L2 authenticator or L3 authenticator. And in the kind of metadata exchange, during the authentication ceremony, this is where you can actually query what level of support the authenticator has. If they don't have it, you can either turn down the request or do some sort of step up or added factor authentication. So we're trying. We think this program addresses can give service providers greater assurance in knowing that the scenario we're talking about is not happening for high value processes.
I love that this document here with the certification levels kind of reminds me of the common criteria items, because when I worked with the government, it was like you had to have an EAL level or an assessment level of 3+ or something to be accepted in certain environments. So I can definitely see how you could use this as well. We're L2+ in terms of authentication or something to be used as a thermometer or a level of security. So is it possible for, I guess this would be outside of the FIDO stuff. I was just thinking of, would there be ways to verify that a mobile device, wasn't jailbroken, and could you say, well, you can't use this as a valid second device, second factor device because, you're not on a non-jailbroken device. Would that be a possibility?
I believe that would be outside of the scope of FIDO to identify whether or not something's jailbroken. But if you're demanding, say, an L3 device, it actually has to go through common criteria testing.
Right.
It has to be common criteria certified.
Okay.
So these added levels of certification actually imply a high degree of integrity of the device itself.
Yeah.
And look, coming back to some of the questions like, well, how do you break FIDO and this and that? I mean, there's certain, what FIDO is aiming to do is preventing scalable attacks, right?
Right.
Or targeted, phishing attacks. But we can't, stop someone from being, as you're mentioning before we started recording, being beaten by a hose and forcing, giving them their password or being, forced to give their biometrics. Like,
right.
those are things that are outside of FIDO's scope. But the scalable attacks, the scalable phishing attacks that are, I think, a huge plague today and growing, and that's what FIDO's trying to address.
That was our show for this week. You can find show notes for this and all of our shows at www.breakingsecurity.com. You can also find an RSS link on the site to add to your favorite podcatcher. You can find all of us on Twitter. Ms. Berlin can be found at InfoSyster, INFOSYSTIR. Mr. Betcher can be found at BetcherPwned, BOETTCHERPWNED. And you can follow me on Twitter at Brian Brake, BRYANBRAKE. We have a Slack. Come join us on our Slack. A lot of great things going on there, a lot of channels of various InfoSec-related subjects. You can get an invite on Twitter by emailing our official Twitter handle for the show at Brakesec, BRAKESEC, or you can email us at bds.podcast@gmail.com. Thank you to all of our Patreon supporters for their monetary assistance by offsetting costs involved in putting out a weekly show. Zoom fees, Libsyn hosting, domain purchase, renewal, equipment upgrades, time and effort building the community we have. We appreciate all of your help and support. If you'd like a t-shirt, stickers, coffee mug, or just to show your support for the show, you can check out our TPub site, www.tpublic.com/user/BDS podcast. We thrive on your feedback. A quick 5-star comment on iTunes or Google Play Store or your favorite streaming service, Spotify, Pandora, what have you, go a long way to gaining us additional visibility. It takes no time at all, and we appreciate your help in spreading the word. That was it for Breaking Down Security this week. Be safe, be well, be kind to one another, take care of yourself because you're the only you have, and we'll talk to you again soon.